Podcast 1, Introduction to Emotion in University Learning and Teaching. Hello, and welcome to Emotion Matters in Higher Education, a podcast series exploring the powerful and often overlooked role of emotion in university learning and teaching. I'm one of the hosts, Dr Kate Ippolito, Principal Lecturer at Imperial College, London. I'm joined by two of my co-hosts.
Hi, I'm Dr. Manuela Mura, and I'm Senior Teaching Fellow in the Faculty of Medicine.
Hi, I'm Dr. Cathy Mansfield. I'm a Senior Strategic Teaching Fellow in Life Sciences. So in this series, we'll be exploring a wide range of perspectives on how emotion functions in higher education. Particularly, we'll be focusing on our own disciplines of science, so STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, maths, and medicine. So whether you're a university teacher, a student, or someone who's interested in educational development, we hope this podcast gives you something to reflect on. The podcast series has developed from a special interest group that we run at Imperial in our own contexts, called Emotion in STEM B, that myself, Manuela and Kate have run at Imperial since early 2024, and we've certainly been planning and thinking about before then. We wanted to capture key ideas from our termly meetings with that network of interested members as a listenable, shareable takeaway resource for staff and students, and the podcast seemed to fit. So, Kate, how did you come to be interested in emotion in university learning and teaching?
Well, after about 2 decades teaching in higher education, I began to notice something. Emotions seemed to be everywhere. Students felt confusion, anxiety, relief, pride, and teachers felt excitement, frustration, apprehension, and satisfaction. But these emotions weren't just background noise. They were central to the way that people were talking and thinking about their teaching and learning experiences. I wanted to learn more about how to work with these emotions and to use them to motivate and support learners and teachers, not ignore them or see emotion as an uncontrollable byproduct. Recently, as programme lead, I found myself increasingly helping colleagues to navigate the emotional landscape of learning and teaching. Specifically, I think we're trying to manage the boundaries between supporting students to cope with the inevitable discomfort associated with confronting things that they don't yet understand or not being able to do things competently, but also, as well as supporting them, not taking away the opportunities for growth and self-belief building that these cognitive and emotional challenges present. And this creates an emotional load for students and for teaching staff that's really important to acknowledge. And that's what I think we'd like to do through these podcasts.
And we had added interesting conversation at our special interest group about what emotions are and what influences them. Perhaps it would be interesting to talk a little bit more about definition, how we define emotion, particularly in the higher education setting.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Manuela. Thank you. So let's take a few minutes to unpack what we mean by emotion, and particularly in this learning and teaching context. So there are many perspectives on what emotions are. Some researchers and theorists, such as Paul Ekman, would say that emotions are discrete. They're universally recognizable entities, such as enjoyment, sadness, anger, disgust, fear, surprise. We can see them in people's faces, regardless of what culture we grow up in what part of the world. And that these emotions, they reside in our brain and they're hardwired from birth. And that these emotions are automatically triggered by the events occurring around us. While others, people like Lisa Feldman Barrett, Mary Helen Imordino-Yang, they would argue that emotions are socially constructed and they're shaped by our interactions with other people, shaped by our culture, language, and also the meaning we make of our physiological sensations. And by that, I mean things like increased heart rate or butterflies in our stomach. How do we interpret that feeling when we're giving a presentation? They argue that emotions are adaptive and useful, and that we as humans, we actively construct them to accommodate or adapt to a variety of different potentially demanding situations. So they would also say that emotions are goal-based. And what I mean by that is that when we find ourselves in particular situations, imagine you're stepping into a classroom as a student or a teacher, we appraise that situation to judge how well it can enable us to meet our goals. And this appraisal or evaluation of the situation, that's what leads to the emotional experience. So let's do a little thought experiment between us and with the listeners. So I'd like you to consider a situation you were in recently that was emotionally powerful and perhaps memorable because it was an emotional experience.
Yes. So, for example, and I think, I suppose, like we have multiple goals at once, right?
Yes.
We have multitask in our lives. And the emotion we feel is the result of these multiple appraisals and the prevailing emotion that we deal with.
Exactly.
So, for example, the other day, I was thinking about a session I need to prepare for next week for my students in the lab. Is about creating a little bit of clarity about what they will be learning in the labs in term 2. But at the same time, I had multiple tasks, like a lot of admin that I needed to deal with. And at the time, the appraisal of the situation was I've got a very limited amount of time, but I want to complete this task well. So I felt the pressure. But as soon as I started to engage with the activity, and I've started to think like what I want to achieve from this particular task, and it was clarity, and I want my student to be really clear about what they have to do without being overwhelmed. And at this point, I started to feel creative and a little bit more open, created a lot of workflows, images, and so on. And I felt, my prevailing emotion, I think it was enjoyment at this point.
Yeah, you're balancing lots of different things there, aren't you? And the goals you have, they're for your learners, they're for yourself, they're in relation to their developing knowledge, their relationships between them, your identity as a teacher. So yeah, I think it's important that we think about the emotional experience we have. So that might be something that's enjoyable or anxiety provoking or somewhere in between that. And then it's useful to think about what your task is. Sorry, what your goal is. And as you said, the goal might be to complete a task. It might be to be judged as successful. It might be to develop relationships with other individuals, or it might be to not embarrass yourself. So something around the social interaction. And then we can think, did the emotion that you experienced in that situation, did it relate to your goals and how? And an outcome of that might be that perhaps our goals aren't that clear. Or as you said, perhaps they're conflicting in some way. That's going to lead to negative emotion for ourselves or for our students, the people that we're interacting with. So I suppose what I find interesting about understanding what emotion is that it can help us to change our emotions, partly by changing our goals, but also the way we think about achieving our goals. So, for example, if my goal is to record a podcast of perfectly articulated ideas, I feel extremely nervous. In fact, so nervous I just don't want to get started. But if my goal is to share my experiences and my developing perspectives and to listen to other people do the same, then I feel curious and I feel less nervous. So I suppose that's how I find it useful.
Yeah, I agree. And some are positive and negative emotion, right? Some are, what we say enjoyment. Some others are, when we can feel very stressed and overwhelmed. But one thing you mentioned earlier, Kate, was about, cognition and emotion, like as they were linked. And I think it's really interesting as we, if we look at the last 30 years of research in neuroscience and psychology, there has been a huge development towards trying to understand what is the interplay between cognition and emotion. And interestingly, emotion has been discovered, they play an important role and a central role in cognition, particularly in learning. For example, they play a role in deploying attention, memorizing, solving problem, making decision, and also transferring what we've learned in a context to another, which is really, really important.
Central.
It seems kind of wild to me that we actually almost can't define exactly what emotion is, and this is still one of the conversations that we're having. I think we've spoken a little bit about the students' emotions, but also need to remember, and certainly my interest is around teacher emotion. So teachers experience a really wide range of emotions as well.
Yeah.
These emotional experiences, they, like students, can be positive, can be negative, and they're vital for kind of personal well-being, professional development, and they're really fundamental. We can't separate these things, and this was definitely something that I found kind of eye-opening when we started thinking about this. So despite the evidence, a lot of kind of STEM subjects are still quite resistant to paying attention to emotion. There's often not a lot of focus on emotion in STEM subjects. I think they sometimes carry a reputation for being emotionally neutral, if you like, despite the fact that our classrooms are filled with student and teacher emotions, as you know. So it's simply not the case that STEM subjects are emotionally neutral. Of course, problem solving, collaboration, group work, planning, all of these have emotions running through them and require some emotional competence. It's not something that we can switch off from our classroom or teaching or education settings. So these are all things that we're going to be discussing in future episodes of the podcasts, as we'll be speaking with educators, researchers, students, wellbeing advisors, all kind of influencing and having perspectives kind of on that narrative and on kind of various aspects of emotion in STEM education. We're going to think a little bit about what attracted us to, I guess, this subject and why we're excited to explore this. So, Manuela, what attracted your attention to emotion in your context of teaching biomedical sciences students?
So during my scientific career, I've often reflected on my own experience as a scientist, but also reflected about the experience of my students in the lab, the students I supervise in the lab. And as we discussed earlier, science is usually associated with cognitive skills, logic, reasoning, being biased, which are very important skills. Don't take me wrong, they're extremely important. But emotion were everywhere, in every aspect of life. So why deny them? Why don't give them importance? So when think about curiosity, the excitement of exploring a new topic, a new area that is unknown to everybody else, or the motivation you find despite the setback, let's say frustration when an experiment fails, or the setback when a paper gets rejected, or even when you have difficult collaborators, or the sheer joy when you make a discovery. All these emotion play really an important role. They're not just background noise, as we said earlier, but they shape the way we learn and we persist in science. So when I had the opportunity to explore an education research topic during my master in university learning and teaching, I was really excited to explore this more systematically. So in my research, I've been questioning, do science students really recognize the role of emotion in science? And if they do so, how do they use emotion purposefully for achieving their goals? Cathy, how did you become interested in emotion in university learning and teaching?
Yeah, it's interesting because so somewhat similar, but actually I would have said to you a few years ago that I wasn't interested in this subject. So I didn't see myself as someone who was interested in emotion. My background, my discipline-specific background is in plant sciences, so cell biology. And certainly kind of as I specialised in science, I would say I'm not really that interested in things like neuroscience and psychology and maybe all things that you would kind of connect with emotion. Having said that, when I was exploring topics as part of my master's in university learning and teaching, I was encouraged to think about what is really central to my teaching philosophy. And when I was thinking about this, like what really matters to me in terms of teaching and learning, what do I prioritise in my teaching? I got myself thinking specifically about positive emotion, in this case, specifically about enjoyment. So yes, I want students to learn something, but actually what I really want from my teaching is for them to enjoy learning something. And similarly, I want to enjoy my teaching. Like, yes, I want to teach effectively, but actually I want to enjoy doing it. And I guess the more I thought about it, the more I realised that positive emotion was central to my own teaching philosophy, and therefore that kind of sparked my own research project into thinking about staff and student enjoyment in teaching and learning. So a lot of the time we focus on negative emotions, and positive emotions often get a little bit overlooked, but actually they're really valued as educators. And just as a really quick kind of thought experiment that I've done with other people, if you ask yourself, if you're an educator, if you think, would you rather your student got a first-class degree and didn't enjoy their learning, or got a 2-1 or 2A as we call it here and did enjoy their learning? And it's really interesting because a lot of educators agree that enjoyment is something that we would really prioritise, but we often don't really think about how to get there.
Yeah, it's interesting when we use the terms positive and negative emotion, isn't it? So I think the work by Reinhard Peckrin and colleagues, where they think about how actually the things we would call negative emotions, such as maybe confusion, frustration, anxiety, they're actually really important for learning. And I talk to students quite a lot about that, and they do recognise that. And I think just normalising that they're going to feel those emotions and maybe reframing the way they see them as central to learning and that they can take some control over them, it really kind of takes the sting out of how they feel about their learning. Manuela, I'm interested in how you've helped students to make sense of their emotions whilst they're learning.
I think the most important aspect is acknowledging emotion. Emotion exists, so if students understand that emotion are part of a process, like, for example, frustration or excitement, they're part of a journey, then they can use this emotion constructively and not feeling overwhelmed by emotion or discouraged by them. But it's also important that aspect of acknowledging is important to understand when students cannot manage emotion, when is the time to ask for help to manage situation that could be, and in pathological situation, for example. So I lead the academic and study skill module in the BSc in Medical Biosciences, and I discussed the role of emotion in science learning with year 1 students in their first week of their learning. And we have very insightful discussions. So it's interesting that some students still identify with, an emotional scientist, but a lot of students, I think, they feel relieved. That is normal to feel.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? So, Cathy, could you tell us more about your specific interest about enjoyment in learning? So we have learning outcomes, but we don't have enjoyment outcomes. Should we?
Well, maybe provocatively, but perhaps we should.
Yeah.
So I think actually a focus on positive emotion can be really helpful. And we tend to focus on kind of positive emotions or emotions in general as secondary to learning. But actually, there's quite a lot of evidence that enjoyment or similar positive emotions can be quite motivating and can kind of start off, for example, triggering interest in a subject. Maybe students want to explore something in more detail if they're enjoying it. And we know that being positive leads to this kind of deeper learning and interest. The other thing I would say is that staff and student emotions are really intrinsically linked. And we'll talk about this in future podcasts. But I think if we really imagine we focused a bit more on positive emotions, perhaps that would kind of be beneficial to staff, but also indirectly be beneficial to students and also kind of encourage that deeper learning. So yeah, maybe let's put it out there that we could think about having kind of enjoyment outcomes as well, or instead of learning outcomes.
Yeah, and we're going to think more about teacher emotions, aren't we? Could that become more central? Manuela, how about you? How do you use what you know about how emotion functions to good effect?
I think all of us, I suppose, teachers, students, everybody, if we should be more attuned with our emotion, because I suppose that if you are aware of your emotion and you try to understand where they come from, what causes them, then you perhaps can use this information to regulate them better, for decision making, as we said earlier. But it's important to kind of be attuned with your emotions. And I suppose that if you didn't know anything about your emotion or you didn't know where they came from, it will be very difficult to regulate them, right?
Yeah.
So I think definitely being attuned and acknowledge emotion and be aware of your emotion.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think those two key elements of emotional literacy, emotional awareness and the ability to regulate your emotions and other people's emotions within that learning context, there's something that are going to come up in future podcasts. Definitely. For sure. So the way I use it, I suppose, is I often support students to think about how they feel about their learning and why. I was doing that with year 1 chemistry students earlier this week and physics students last week. And I think it's really important to highlight that it's a normal experience to feel this range of pleasant and unpleasant emotions. Students tell me it's useful. They tell me that this idea is quite new to them, to think about emotion in the context of learning, as you said. They say they feel better for knowing how their peers feel and more in control from understanding that uncomfortable emotion can actually be valuable for learning, as I was saying. I think beyond being a teacher, knowing more about how emotion functions in higher education, for me, was motivated by a concern that I was trying to address. I became more involved in work around student mental health and well-being, which included training for our personal tutors and contributing to Imperial's mental health and well-being strategy. And as the sector began advocating for well-being embedded in the curriculum, I started to ask myself questions like, what does this really mean? What does it mean in science curricula? What can we reasonably expect of university staff? How much can they know about emotion in learning and teaching? And also, what emotions are actually being experienced in university learning settings and why? And which of these emotions are important for learning? We don't want to try to design out emotions that, as you say, Manuela, are central to learning. And I try to answer these questions through my research and practice, I suppose. And broadly, I'm advocating for an emotion-informed understanding of wellbeing and learning that doesn't pathologise uncomfortable emotion, but sees it as an important piece of information or an important signal about the needs and goals of the learners and also the teachers, as you say, Cathy. And so that they all feel equipped to respond, including through seeking help. You mentioned that, didn't you, Manuela? So can we design higher education to promote more positive emotion, but also understand this range of emotion? And that's what I get really kind of quite excited about and look forward to exploring through these podcasts.
So I guess that's kind of where we'll stop for today, but that's primed us, if you like, to think about well-being, which we'll do in our next 2 episodes with our student well-being advisors, Anna Goodwin and Becky Zamora, who will share their expertise on how they help students understand their emotions and how to kind of cope with emotion-inducing transition points in higher education. So we hope that the podcast has helped you to develop a deeper appreciation of what we mean by emotion and why emotion matters in higher education and how we can more deliberately work with it. Thanks for listening.